Hello everyone, today we talk about Gustavus Adolphus infantry innovation and troops in general. I already made an introductory video to Gustavus Adolphus military innovations. It's a pretty large one because of course it's important to frame correctly the figure, not just historically but in the actual context of Swedish military expansion in the first half of the 17th century. Today's video deals with infantry, which I also discussed in another video. It's very similar to this, but not quite the same, about in fact the Swedish infantry and colored regiments, literally called, that we will be seeing today, because they were essentially standard, beginning to be uniform, right, with certain specific colors, at least in the way they were recognized in this case as regiments slash brigades, because you know that the Swedes come up with this new, say, organic that had in part been modeled on Maurice of Nassau's Dutch accomplishments. In that video about Gustavus Adolphus innovations, we speak about what this technically is. So this video is not entirely dedicated to tactics per se, but just to Gustavus Adolphus' reorganization of the Swedish infantry. At some point we will hopefully make a video about the early Vasa's armies. And today we deepen a little bit that criticism on the concept of innovation, that in many ways was not just something that Gustavus Adolphus dreamt randomly of one night and came up with, and revolution, warfare, whatever. Actually, some of the innovations attributed to Gustavus Adolphus, as to basically any great military reformer, not only are often spurious, but they wouldn't kick in this case, in the Swedish army, even before a couple of generations after the guy. So one should always distinguish the prowess, the greatness, the vision of this commander, his military experience, his extraordinary courage, and that's something we will look at, but not confusing it with the modernistic and technologistic positivism that has been a bit sown over these figures, especially as heroes of Protestantism. So buying to the notion that there was some particular opening to greater scientific or technological thought. As a matter of fact, as we will see now, some Swedish innovations that succeeded on the battlefield were paradoxically due, not directly in that sense, to actually a Swedish backwardness, right? For example, the increase in musketry fire power is something that, yes, was it was well, channeled and handled and refined by Gustavus Adolphus, but in part this stemmed from the fact that up to that point the Swedes had not had particularly good pike formations. They had been struggling still in the late, as late as the late 16th and the early 17th century, having one. So they sort of kicked in even with that idea, okay, we'll be using more shots. So every country has actually its story, right? You know that the English during the Civil War arrived to that because of the hedges, because of this sort of civil war, in fact, fought everywhere where, in fact, this bulky pike formations could not quite be deployed in the same way. Equally, the Spanish, the Imperials, were not really lagging that behind to their Protestant counterparts, and we will have to make videos about that. But it is definitely true that, especially in the Swedish case, there was an important, let's say, doctrinal, it may be a slightly anachronistic terminology, but truly tactical organic innovation that was due to the specific needs of Sweden at the time, politically, strategically, and that only through that, in fact, can be properly understood, because some are counterintuitive, right? Having smaller calibers, for example, having the possibility even of angling in a different way with smaller forces, but sort of more synchronized, more in tandem, more with a greater collective training, esprit de corps, is all something that comes up because, again, of the particular situation of Sweden, the French financing, the Polish and Danish military experience, matured in fact by Gustavus Adolphus and his ancestors, and that all needed a guy, however, to to have it worked, right, with the dramatic, actually tragic, but still splendid and heroic expedition of the same king into Germany, right, where he also lost his life, notoriously enough. So it's going to be a bit of a mishmash of different considerations, but I hope to keep the line adequately. So, first of all, Gustavus Adolphus as a figure, right, he came to the throne pretty young. He was 17 years old in 1611, and he, found himself in a pretty delicate situation, given that the main neighbors of Sweden, that is Denmark and Poland, as the major powers around, that were hostile to his rule, actually had better armies than the Swedish one. Again, the Swedish army, we will see it better again in another video, but had not particularly progressed, like, if not, especially at sea, like the Swedes were technically the first, had the first navy who actually began to design specific types of military vessels, right? Meaning not civilian ones, eventually, adapted to military purpose, but properly in the military, in naval engineering. That purpose was a young nation, a fresh one to some degree. It is also the relative simplicity of the recruitment system that favored, that also the compactness of the country, in a national sense, favored the the development of the Swedish military, of the empire. And yet, again, this was all to happen. Gustavus would, of course, carry most of this out. Telling the truth, the Swedish recruitment system was also imperfect together with backwards at that point. The Swedish battle organization was improvised, and up to that point had been just needed on a temporary basis. I mean, not all powers went out there thinking to fight the great pitched battles among, major powers, right? This was something extremely costly. It had to entail a specific politics and strategy that Sweden had not quite gotten to the scale of at that point. And especially there was not, at least an adherence to the administrative expectations that had been naturally growing in the early modern age and the actual practice, right? This is really a valid problem for everyone, right? Nearly all armies were chronically understrength, and on campaign things would deteriorate further. There were great problems in financing them, the contracting, just equipping the troops, keeping them supplied. So these are all things that we can't see in this video alone, but we talk about the 30 Years' War in general, but still extensively, and so we got a picture of what, especially before the rise of Gustavus Adolphus' army, that was the top, the best one of the 30 Years' War, that landscape looked like on a regular basis. And again, also, the Swedes at the top of their power were not, light years ahead, right? Everything was very difficult to make work, to keep standing, right? So even just after great names, great commanders, you do not have immediately that sort of structural continuity in the system to replicate itself. War was starting to be, just the necessities of modern war, at least, were bringing the military to be ever more, in fact, professional, permanent, and definitely the Swedish Empire would grow thanks to Gustavus Adolphus. But again, it's not a deterministic assumption. Gustavus, in spite of his youth, was immediately into military stuff, right? The age, at this point, was pretty soaked with the sense that the European military had to be designed in a typically Renaissance mindset on the military systems of the ancients, right? The political military system of the ancients. The Protestant regimes were definitely monarchic, but they had a sort of more Republican mindset. Well, this is especially true for the Dutch, not quite the Swedes, but I mean the idea that the soldier, that subject, had to be turned into a vital element that would have to self-sacrifice. We made a video recently about the Protestant ethics, right, influencing this mechanisms, and partly also the one that the same Protestants were criticizing of the Catholic orders, right, in terms of uniformity, actually was adopted further at this point. Maurice of Nassau, about whom we made also a video explaining his reforms, was pretty famously studying, he had the Roman legions, the Macedonian phalanxes, and of course, even though Renaissance warfare was much more advanced than the one of classical civilization, still the idea, especially of having rigidly drilled, standardized arms of some sort on the basis of ancient armies was pretty in vogue, especially among leaders, politically and militarily, and it was part of the times, part of the Great Renaissance, and it's increased in understanding in history, in philology, in fact in ancient languages as well, and the advantages deriving from such military systems that naturally entailed necessarily a centralized state to some degree, appeared as the most pressing necessities of powers that were really pressed by a great metus hostilis. I mean, the 80 Years' War, for the Dutch was definitely this, an existential fight. The Swedes, as we will see, are in fact a bit more monarchic, and they are driven more by the ambition of Gustavus, but they also had a lot to earn just by the situation that was forming itself in Central Europe, in the Baltic, so they would go for it. And given that with the Dutch they had an important connection, they were both Protestants, there were something they had in common, especially in their strategy towards Denmark, etc. The young Gustavus was quite influenced by Maurice of Nassau's example. In fact, he met with the Dutch ruler multiple times in 1620, and this naturally informed him with that kind of mentality, but also the practical applications that the Dutch army could make of this broader ideas. And again, between the two things, it was a big gap. We shouldn't think that at any point, literally, these guys were pretending to copy those ancient military systems, as if they could literally, be employed at the time. If anything, because of course everybody knew that warfare was quite different. But we're talking, in fact, about a know-how and at least some kind of wisdom that unfortunately is also lost to a great extent. Now we have these schemes of the Dutch companies, the Swedish brigades, etc. But even though we have even illustrations of the time about them, we do not actually have the proof of how they were used and how regularly. We observed this in the video about Maurice of Nassau, because we do get from the sources some hint that things were a bit different, to say the least, than the neat, modern need of visualizing them. It's not that they did not exist, again, but every battle is something on its own. Things get pretty messy, and definitely there's not that level of complete standardization that you can expect, especially at an operational tactical level. In any case, the Swedes were also influenced by their military experience against the Russians, the Poles, and the Danes, which were a very important assortment, given that we're ranging from some of the, I guess, most backward sort of primitive contexts, like the Russian one that still fought basically with medieval knights of Mongol model, by the way. The Poles that actually were a hell of a military, but they also had this anachronism of success, the famous hussars that really, gave some headaches, to say the least, to the Swedes on multiple occasions, and the Danes that sort of fit still the Western standards, and that at least at the beginning of the 30 Years' War were actually one of the finest armies around, except they were small, and what they did actually would end up paving the way to Swedish intervention in Germany under Gustavus, who evolved, in fact, his awareness of the necessity of a highly effective system of military organization. At least that, right? This went in parallel with equipment and training. And in many ways, you can't, again, see a determinism in the Swedish tactical accomplishment. I mean, if it hadn't been for Gustavus Adolphus, we would have not had some of the tactical masterpieces of the time. Sometimes you may have all the ingredients, but not really knowing how to use them, or maybe you can even know that, but you do not have the will to carry out the rest correctly. And the Clausewitzian theory in this is quite clear, right? There are very peculiar psychological characteristics that make a military genius, and definitely Gustavus Adolphus was one of the greatest military minds of his time. So Gustavus would give an example of this also personally, right? This was a time, again, we like to think of this bigger systems, whatever, but it was still a very archaic, traditional, and especially in the Swedish case, primitive time. The idea that war was a sort of aristocratic sport, that kings were just chosen by God in virtue of their superior genetics to lead the world out of the generation that the sin had brought on, and that from their individual choices the entire balance of the universe depended, is proven by Gustavus' generalship and gallantry. Just think that he was wounded 13 times, which was already at the time where still noblemen, also monarchs, still fought on the field, exposing themselves quite danger, and that really made him also temperamentally the Lion of the North, right? Quite spot on nickname. And he definitely worked with, especially in the in his early military career, with this is Swedish-based national army, right? It's a short time, the one of his rise, after all, considering what he achieved during the 30 Years' War, but he went by steps as well, and at some other point we will see what this was step by step about. Sweden was the obvious basis over which a national army could be founded. Gustavus was the king of the country. He had sovereignty on it, and so he could demand, on the basis of what he expected, of course he could give his country back, particular military requirements. First of all, he raised an awareness also among his generals, etc. Again, Sweden was pretty sheltered up to this point in the broader development of Renaissance Europe. It was just not almost Eastern power, where, say, the Renaissance inside had arrived gradually, or at least there wasn't much of a political, social, cultural background to make it stick particularly. But it was definitely a matter of minds as well, especially among the leaders. His methods could be harsh and impositive, especially when we think about, the means employed to source cannon fodder. The Finns, for example, would provide a disproportionately large contribution compared to the Swedes. That also, we know some villages in Sweden at some point were decimated by Gustavus wars, but the Finns specifically provided 9 infantry and 3 cavalry field regiments. As we will see now, is a pretty large amount of troops. And you know that Finland, I mean a bit about medieval Finland, and yes, that's not the Renaissance part, the early modern age, but the dynamics we trace there in terms of the relation between Sweden and Finland, and especially between the Swedes and the local Finns, are quite valid also for this time. Levels of traumatically shocking brutality, but also this, of course, served for Swedish success at the time. But these 2 northern countries, in spite of such volatile sovereign, had their demographic limits that couldn't be overly stretched. Even more importantly, yes, you could try to build through the Protestant ideal and cause. These are some of the most fiercely intense levels of confessional war propagandas. You know, from the mid 17th century, things would start changing. But here, like confessional beliefs are literally a universal existential identity for everyone involved. Like, these people truly believe in their evangelical mission, but materially as well, you couldn't quite squeeze out of the system magically some efficient troops out of the blue without further background. Reason for which, and this had been of great concern for Gustavus from a political and economical point of view, the Swedish establishment was advocating, at least some of it, that the most enlightened, in fact, it would succeed in the end, but that otherwise would have not achieved what Gustavus did. Needed military professionals. In other words, mercenaries in the larger amount you could find generally abroad at some reasonable cost. It was high, yes, but it did really make the job done, considering that Europe was constantly at war, way or another, and the predominant nationalities of such Swedish hired mercenaries were Scottish and German. Right, I made a video about the Scottish lowland pikemen. We briefed some months ago during, themed about the early modern age, the Renaissance period. We marginally added something about the Scottish service in Sweden in the Swedish army. We will, however, make a dedicated video to that, just because it's very important. This is not just the Scots, it's also the Irish in part. But generally speaking, the Celtic Fringe, as I explained in other videos about the sort of moral, cultural, ethnic background of early modern mercenaries, was, providing with, especially Northern Europe, also in Poland, right, with pretty large amount of troops, right. Think that the Scottish alone provided a field marshal, at least 6 generals, and nearly 30 colonels and some 30,000 men to the Swedish army alone. Right, this is insane. Right, during Gustavus Adolphus period. So we're talking about pretty large amount of troops. And the reason being that, of course, these Celts were incredibly brutal. They just lived sort of in part. I mean, they were quick to learn, of course, the new military insights. They just knew very well, even individually, how to use the most updated technologies, since they had come around. But they came from countries that had literally stopped to the Middle Ages. These were people that, in their Highlanders, were swordsmen, were still just literally meeting each other as single war bands and literally spending the entire combat chopping each other to pieces, right, on a regular basis. And that's the mental background we're talking about, something that you don't even want to know remotely what it means, especially if you live in today's world. When Gustavus Adolphus entered the war in the Holy Roman Empire, 2/5 of his forces were foreign, and while he was in Germany, over a half of them were. This is not so strange after all, because if we look, we talk about this in the videos about the 30 Years' War, at the regular composition of the forces, especially those who would stick around on a regular basis. Mercenaries paradoxically were sort of less likely to, so they would form that nucleus that would still make the army, because they were just more habituated. They had they had come voluntarily, right, differently from the levies and so on. So this is debatable to some extent, but you know what a mess the 30 Years' War really was, and also more or less what Gustavus Adolphus' strategy also was, and needing to leave troops behind as he was marching south towards Germany, so that Wallenstein at that point tried sort of to cut his supply lines from the Baltic, attacking from the east, basically the northeast. All things that we will look at. There is a video that is called The Strategy of the 30 Years' War that in parts addresses this, but this did of course influence Gustavus Adolphus' troop supply sources, right? So it's not strange at all to hear this. We are far from the full idea of a prevalently national army in a statal sense, right? The French of Louis XIV would actually achieve this in a couple of generations, but even some of the major powers in Europe wouldn't until well into the 18th, right? So Sweden was, again, limited in potential. This increased the national contribution, but as you see, the way they fought, at the end of the day, considering also there was a lot of French money, again, that was supplying this, because otherwise they would have not made it, right? There is no doubt that, again, the Swedish Army of the 30 Years' War is a French creation. But still, right, this was exactly what Richelieu wanted. And the sense is, of course, that you can't keep paying as long as you want these guys to go on fighting. There will be through that medium always some soldier that want to be hired, and it was completely normal having people from different nationalities coming to fight there for different reasons. Just their internal dynamics. We've seen the Celtic French is kind of obvious, right? They were hungrier, right? And they had less to lose. But this is true also for a much greater amount than we usually give credit for. What is important, though, and this speaks volumes about Gustavus Adolphus' control of his troops, was the fact that all these foreign elements were still trained and organized on the basis of the Swedish units. And the, in fact, tactical insights that we will look at today, especially at the infantry, right? Naturally, the infantry was the most important element of the armies by the Renaissance, and yet, as you know, there was a lot of combined arms, as always, that with the rise of gunpowder technology, power, of course, was creating this new insights on, especially the coming back of cavalry of cold steel, paradoxically, because pikes were going down now from the second half of the 16th century, and so infantry was less defended than before, and of course artillery as well. Again, today I will not we will talk a lot about tactics as such, so we will of course see most of what we already discussed, but still in other videos there is a better explanation of why the Swedes went for certain specific dynamics and mechanisms on the battlefield, and why they could afford to do that, right? Or why they were forced, that's also always the flipping of the coin, to fight like that and do it successfully, right? They didn't find the way to win everything. They got their defeats, but they still had the upper hand, the best army of the war, because the best army in Europe, actually, at that point, under Gustavus, right? Then eventually Sweden has this this phase under Charles XII, where it's still, in fact, the most advanced army in Europe. Not the most powerful, eventually, because it was not still, in spite of the empire, an enormous country. But, right, the bases are laid a bit here, and hopefully we'll cover all these broader times. So, speaking of recruitment and administration, the Swedish army of Gustavus Adolphus times was organized in provincial Land-Regiments, each of which, by the 20s of the 17th century, provided 3 so-called, in fact, infantry Field-Regiments, each of which counted 8 companies. In theory, in the Renaissance, you had the regiment composed by something like between 6-12 companies, normally 8-10, something like this. I made a video on this, that basically regiments were chronically understrength to the point that these other formations, like the Swedish Brigade, would take shape, right? These field regiments, in the Swedish case, had 8 companies, specifically after the adoption of the smaller styles one in the used by the Dutch in the same 20s of the 17th century. If the matter troubles you, it's that simple. I mean, the Lance regiment in theory had to be like a normal regiment, right? But the Dutch had introduced smaller units that could, as we'll see now also in the Swedish case, favor maneuverability and flex, especially interaction between the various arms. So at an administrative level, you would have this provincial regiments that, however, were split into 3 field regiments, and that as such would contain 8 companies, but you should multiply for 3 if you would like to know what they were at the provincial level. And this was because these companies were smaller than the average ones that we've seen before, that would arrive up to, 12 in a, say, imperial Spanish army, right? So this is the insight that Gustavus Adolphus had derived already at the organizational and operational tactical level, as we'll see better now from Maurice of Nassau, right? Tactically, there was yet another unit established as early as 1618, which had essentially 4 of the new style companies. So every field regiment was split in 2 squadrons, each squadron containing in all 216 pikemen and 288 musketeers, ideally. Again, also these units would be understrength, as we will see now. In this organic, still 96 of the musketeers would normally be detached or, quote, commanded. This is the specific terminology here, as a forlorn hope. And this detachment was crucial in Swedish tactics because such musketeers were often employed to support the cavalry, right? The Swedes, under Gustavus Adolphus, begin to announce at a small tactical level this increasing combined arms tactics to wear out much bigger and less wieldy tactical formations, such as stereotypically the bulky, pike square of the Spanish tercio was a bit weighted to fight, in a bit sort of a more passive way. In a way, this happened because Sweden was also a smaller power, so technically this was also about the Schwerpunkt of their enemies, right? It's not. We'll have to talk about. We still haven't talked about the Spanish and the Imperials, but there would be lots of interesting things to say. But it is true that their armies, being larger, had on average this sort of weaker spot right in the not necessarily sloppy, but of course as a larger force, sort of a less qualitative approach that needed a great energy, especially at a larger scale level, again, individual commitment, especially money, and further continuous operation that cost an enormous lot. So especially in Germany, things were getting complicated for that, but we will see it. We surely make other videos about the 30 Years' War. I only made so far the one of Freiburg. Towards the end of the war is basically the French against the Habsburgs. We don't see the Swedes in action, and there is yet another evolution there, but fundamentally they were similar, right? The increase of firepower towards the end of the war was a fait accompli, and here the Swedes had been really path openers. Sometimes in a literal sense, because the way they would wipe the hell out of, entire chunks of enemy units in front of them through these tactics. Alternatively, the aforementioned detached musketeers could guard the baggage train. They could have other special duties of some sort, and this also tells you like how important, generally speaking, the musketeers, such like the shot was becoming, and how much it was autonomizing itself. Right, the use of pikes, even among what on paper were pikemen, the same Swedish army in Germany, dropped drastically, right? In all the various operations, environments, etc. At some point, these guys would be better without the pike. Naturally, adopting some, either shortening the pike, that was yet another thing that the commanders were not very happy of in general, because the idea is that, yes, it takes more energies to wield a greater pike, but the effectiveness of large pike formations based on the length of the pike itself, and so your collective training that is very intense to maintain order formation. But since, again, most engagements in war are not particularly large ones, the practicalities of campaign would bring you to shorten the pike, and on the long run this would become in fact obsolete, as you well know. And this has also to do with the tiredness of the times, in a way, but not entirely, depending on who they were, what they could do. It depends on the scale of the armies, it depends on who was commanding them, how many resources were devolved to them, etc. At the smallest organic level, you recognize in the Swedish so-called corporalships, that is to say either 4-6 men files of musketeers or 3 of pikemen, the organization of the Dutch army as well. As well, here we describe essentially a Dutch battalion, right, considering all the units together. And the Dutch would normally draw up in 3 large groups as well in combat, right? And these would be known as, there were different terminologies, battles, right, or brigades. And so in the 20s of the 17th century, St. Gustavus Adolphus develops this system further, so much that this will pass, it will be more famous than the Dutch one, in taking the name, in fact, of the Swedish brigade, that was originally of 6 and later of 4-3 squadrons. Basically, the regiment had been bypassed, right? In part because the troops were less, you never had the full strength, but especially you needed more these units teaming up tactically, rather than just serving under a same banner, right? A priori. And this reveals just by itself the autonomy, the tactical autonomy of these units, that we will learn a bit better now of. Essentially, Gustavus Adolphus created a spearhead, right? You would have here. I don't show you the picture, but if you Google the Swedish brigade, it's essentially a sort of cross formation, a spearhead one, where you have the pikes still essentially as the effect of the spearhead, but you have, especially on the sides, a greater alternation of musket and pike units, with the former creating some channels of fire that support the advance of the pike. So these look futuristic at the time, but they're still pretty sort of slow, ferruginous things compared to, of course, what just European tactics would have gotten a couple of generations later. But this still was a very important step further, because you had more autonomous units, right, that instead of operating just under all crammed together under in a single regiment and fundamentally having to respond only to that structure, they would be employed autonomously, and with as a consequence, given that the enemies had not really changed much inside, in order to succeed, a much greater interaction between the pike and shot at a smaller unit level, with also an ever more dynamic use of artillery. Today, I would like to say this: we will not talk about cavalry and artillery specifically, so we'll stop to infantry. But as you know, Gustavus Adolphus took major steps in not just the uniformation of the calibers to make the main batteries fire more reliable, but also the introduction of mobile artillery that naturally came up at smaller calibers, but still was employed in an unprecedentedly aggressive way. Mobile artillery existed from the late Middle Ages. I made some weeks ago a video actually dedicated to at least the types of artillery in the late Middle Ages, and with that attention towards the problem, I made a video about the Battle of Molinella that deals with that as well, at the very beginning of this. But the most important thing in the case of Gustavus Adolphus' army is, of course, the synergy of all the three arms in a way that would remain conceptually the same for centuries. That is, you should always use against the enemy a full combination of cavalry, infantry, and artillery, close range and with close interaction, which is very difficult to do. Only the best trained troops are capable of interacting that way, but that when succeeding in that synchrosis, in that synergy, really are unstoppable, right? At least if the enemy is not on the same footing. So this was very innovative. When we look at the Swedish brigades, we also notice that in the 30 Years' War, these units were permanently camped together. They stood as 7 brigades of 3 squadrons each, and they were the famous, in fact, colored. Sometimes I made a video about this. They're called regiments, but they can't be considered as the brigades themselves. They were the colored ones, right? Not only. There was the Yellow Brigade, named after its leading unit, the Yellow or Household Regiment, that was made up by Teufel's Germans. We had the Green Brigade, led by Hepburn's Green Regiment, that had the greater colors of the brigade. Then there are all some tactical considerations. There are some doubts even about what these colors actually were at different times, because they're based on different sort of sources that sometimes not necessarily reliable. In the Green Brigade, you would have Mackay's regiment, as well as were largely or wholly made up of Scots. You have the Blue one, led by Winkel's Germans, and was mostly made up of Germans. You have the Red Brigade with Hogendorf's Red Regiment, you see here they have even switched basically by importance the hierarchy of the organic. You have the regiments contained, depending on how they were termed. You have Erik Hans Ostgotha Regiment, Karl Hartz Vasgotha Regiment. These were Swedish. The White Brigade, led by Witzum's regiment, the Black Brigade, that was Thurn's German regiment, and Ake Oxenstierna's brigade was made up entirely by Swedes. And naturally, they could combine the various companies that were still, as you see here, recruited in different, grouped also through different criteria, right? They weren't perfectly homogeneous forces, but what really mattered was their level of collective training. And these colors were crucial because of the increased tactical, say, fluidity, so that you would have to need at different, say, when these guys literally appeared, immediately who they were, so you could, and you would know exactly who you could rely on, what you could do about that, what kind of forces they had, etc. And this is valid. I made a video about, if I'm not wrong, the Swedish flags and dress at this time, dealing with that aspect of uniformation of the troops as well, even though after 2 months of campaign, even optimistically, your uniform have melted away, right? And the Swedish army was pretty well organized. I mean, squadrons and brigades were organically kept up pretty well throughout the storms of war during the campaign, right? It's rather the individual strength of the units being often much lower than what it should have been on paper. And this is particularly true, I mean, this is true for all armies of the time, but especially in the most attritional scenarios. When Gustavus infantry regiments were in Germany, for example, you had still the regiment on paper existed organically, as we've seen. So aside from the tactical, the tactical units that, as we've seen, were important, and it counted, as we've seen, 8 companies, at least the Field-Regiment, as we've seen, a smaller one with the Dutch model companies, counting altogether only 500, 600 men. So this would also bring for each regiment just 1 squadron rather than 2, right? And this naturally reflects itself numerically down to every level. Several German regiments had 12 companies, a few 16. You do not really see much of the 2 squadron strength anymore because would sum this unit, but you would have just not enough troops to make the 2nd squadron, right? So they prefer to have just one, and also balancing out on the practical effectiveness of how these units would perform in combat. That's how armies really evolve by themselves. You see, when we talk about innovation, reforms, whatever, what actually matters is what happens on the field. The fact that this was the normal state of affairs would bring these units just to reinforce themselves in particular ways organically, and that, so we say, but Gustavus Adolphus' armies was like that. Yeah, but he didn't really envisage that just per se. There are much more impacting factors that just armies undergo throughout their service that the leaders are aware of and that they're able to handle and to profit from. But again, this is just the warfare of the time that makes it mostly, and you can't even properly foresee it until it happens. Swedish discipline and training in Gustavus Adolphus' armies were excellent. For the time being, there is no doubt that the particular tactical model perfected by the Swedish monarch was due, of course, to the incredible quality of his troops. They were well equipped, well supplied, well motivated. They had an esprit de corps. There was this wisely balanced combination of levies and professionals. As you see, the fact that these troops were also from different national backgrounds did not really bother them in the first place, because the foreigners were actually the best troops, and the Swedish nationals at least had that national glue by themselves under their sovereigns. This is completely normal. If you look at medieval armies, you realize that very often the best troops were foreign, and there's really nothing strange about that. This to say also, and you know that I care about that, looking at history in a very particular way, that this was still a medieval system, right? It's useless for us to kid ourselves that this was the modern era. Modern era never existed, let's be honest about that. It's just the Middle Ages basically lasting until 1792 or 1919, depending on the countries, right? But that's fundamentally the thing, politically, militarily, and socially, and especially at this time. The same Swedish element was very disciplined by itself, right? It was a bit the envy of other countries. Again, Sweden was tighter, more compact. It is true, but again, the military instrument that came out of it was so well polished and refined that it scored what it did in Germany. And you know, the 30 Years' War was big news for everyone, and so that's where the Swedes had the capacity of proving themselves. We will see it better, but in early Vasa's times, when you look at this primitive Swedish militia that literally had to provide still with its own equipment or whatever, you realize, yes, they were just militia, but there are encounters where they literally, like, they proved to be pretty tough, pretty, ready to just even assault fortified position under fire. So they're just militia, but they do that. They reform and they reattack. I mean, it doesn't happen all the time. It's not the militia that changes the game here, but the character of this pretty archaic Northern European people really does confer, even in the same Gustavus, right, individually, some very important moral qualities to the Swedish army during the 30 Years' War. There are also interesting religious notes here. For example, really all confessions were tolerated, right? There were Catholics in the Swedish armies as in others, right? That's pretty important. The army had its own preachers, and every man was issued with a prayer book specifically. This we don't have time to digress simply on that, but again, I made that video about how the Protestant ethics, even over Catholic soldiers, say in the Swedish army, would impact, in fact, the new modern military training that was in large part based on this sense of self-sacrifice, but also of personalization. I don't know how to say that in English, and this went in parallel naturally, as we will see now, with traumatically brutal discipline, to say the least. It may sound nice that there was actually no flogging in the Swedish army, but there was the very cute practice of running the gauntlet that was actually even, arguably even worse, the gatlopp in Swedish, which basically consists in running, with across the, your unit of say 200 men and being beaten right, at your passage, and these were things that would really break people. The death penalty, of course, existed for such offenses as, quote, despising divine service a third time, which tells you how important that religious indoctrination really was for what was trying to be achieved here was that the mechanical obedience, right? Soldiers were being conceived ever more as machines. They had to be able to repeat certain movements under fire in an increasingly messed up, say, much more crushing battlefield scene from the perspective of an individual soldier compared to previous centuries, but in such a way that was coordinated with the others, and every single individual there had to step in line in a way that would not endanger others, right? This would be maximized eventually in the further centuries in linear tactics, but let's say you can't avoid a cannonball smashing into you, you can't break the formation, you have to die fundamentally just to maintain the order, right? And this would be brought really to the extremes later on. I have some videos incoming to this also on Prussian discipline, etc., that really have a lot to do with the actual beliefs of the times. I mean, the religion was seen as a necessary ingredient just to make a soldier willing, literally, to lose his life, not just for the cause, but for the mechanisms through which such obedience was pursued, right? And the drill masters were quite persuasive, to say the least. So in many ways, this rigidity that you see also in, for example, Cromwell's armies, or the one of the commanders of the Covenant, is really strongly impressed. I mean, consider that here the Protestants are still the underdog, right? These countries, especially England, the Netherlands, will skyrocket at the end of the century and in the following one. But at this point, even Sweden, as we've seen, it's just a newcomer. The Dutch were literally, and would keep fighting for their existence. The English had remained, at least until the new model army, a very backward system compared to the continent. So there is a pressure felt by these peoples that is channeled pragmatically into the ranks, right, through discipline, through the necessity of, at a political level, to stick together in a way that is that rigid and that ethically challenging, as you know, in the Protestant background, as much as it is identifying in that Protestant context. As we were noticing before, the Swedish tactics had been in part an improvement, a development of the Dutch model. This topic is quite important in itself. I will not simply, spend it in this video entirely, because it's probably also a very controversial one, just per se. My personal understanding of this is that more or less all armies, also the Catholic ones, were actually undergoing similar mechanisms, right? While the Dutch were experimenting with their increased amount of, let's say, firepower alternation between the Pike units, the Spanish were actually doing the same, right? There are the insights were literally the same. The problem is how and why would you need to implement them at different times, right? There were countries that still had, as we've seen, for example, a greater bias towards cavalry, right? This was true even for a fairly updating model like the French one, and those managed to beat the Spanish territory. Yes, of course, there was a lot of firepower introduced, etc., but not all armies were equal, and it doesn't matter how much the Dutch and the Swedes had in common and they would exchange with one another. Still, my take is that they evolved on very different bases, at least, towards basically the same direction that basically warfare would gradually take with the general evolution of the Statal models, the increase of firepower, and so on. This, again, were path openers. They were the nations that sort of arrived there earlier because they were also, again, in the dire straits that obliged them to do so, in order the favorable conditions that would not necessarily even bring them in being essentially superpowers or necessarily the best armies out there, but still, right? Again, all these countries had different records. For example, the Dutch army from the end of the 17th to the beginning of the 18th century was the best army in history in terms of cost. So speaking economically here, the way this military administration was handled financially and the benefit. Again, the Caroliner were the best soldiers in the world in their times. But then, of course, things change, and they do for a reason. And there are other powers, there are other models, etc. The Prussians, if you want to highlight the Protestant connection, of course, the ones that bring the concept to the utmost extreme. But also in that case, it's because Prussia was a B-series power, right? And so they had their own problems. They had the miracles of the House of Brandenburg to actually save them from annihilation, in spite of being actually the best army qualitatively, which doesn't mean, again, in absolute terms that you are again. The United States are the only true global power still. And of course, qualitatively speaking, say the Australian army is superior. And the Belgian army even, but the Australia or Belgium cannot go at war like the United States can, right, for the same extent and so on. So it's important to toy with these ideas when you explain this dynamics. But if we still, of course, can spot some Dutch-Swedish connections, of course, we can look at for example, the fact that musketeers were drawn up only 6 ranks deep and trained both to fire by countermarch 2 ranks at a time and to double the files, extending to 3 deep formation to deliver concerted volleys, every man firing at once. The front rank kneeling, the second crouching, the third standing upright. Right, the Swedish were essentially the ones that had halved the 6 ranks in order to extend the line in width, but increasing firepower at a given moment. Right, and remember that before Kord died in the 19th century, once you shot the first salvo, you couldn't literally see anything on the battlefield. And the reason why the Swedes do this is that they're more pressured. They have sort of the best soldiers for the reasons we have seen politically, strategically. Actually, we haven't seen them that much, but still they're motivated enough to be that aggressive. And so their philosophy here is hit the hardest in the short amount of time, and crush with combined arms. If you fire this single volley where all the soldiers are firing without alternating, but just again the 3 ranks shooting all at once, you will, in interest of time, by the same amount of shots fired, cause such a devastating damage psychophysically to the enemy that you can follow up with a, say, cavalry charge that was something, again, coming back on European battlefields, but that the Swedes really pioneer, like the first ones to abandon properly the caracole tactics that had been sort of the most important of the previous generations, because again they have more firepower. They can concentrate against the pikes. They can soften them up in that moment, shooting with all those musketeers at a time, so that the cavalry has enough say, advantage at that moment to charge into the enemy. And consider that the Caracol had been abandoned also because of that 96 musketeers detachment that in part came from the fact that the lines had widened because the ranks had been halved, and so the musketeers were not just shooting from the line, but some literally following in basically open order the cavalry, sometimes even with light artillery pieces, to literally cut to pieces the enemy in front of them with that immense enclosed firepower. Because you see, the point that the advantage there against the Imperial Spanish model is that those were the richer guys, right? They had a bulkier formations, but in that sense, they were less wieldy. And so if you, with smaller units that were more close with one another, better amalgamated, better drilled, etc., you could wear them out, right, in detail, like step by step, chunk by chunk, just by exploiting the asymmetry, say, of the angle of fire, whatever, and by coming so close, like nobody had literally ever seen, right? And it's very interesting, again, especially with Cold Steel, that cavalry comes back, also because, again, of the traumatic experience suffered by the Swedes against the Polish hussars, that in some cases, when they had worn out enough, the Swedish pikemen would literally charge them, which you wouldn't see in Western battlefields because the hussar lances were longer than the Western pikes, and that's not what made the magic, was if they had worn out the pikemen enough, but still, right? And so you would see Cold Steel substituting even firepower, at least in as far as the cavalry arm alone was concerned. That now was interacting with a empowered missile, fire, the shot, right, as it called, like an arm. And this tells you a lot about the system. To the weight of fire which these new tactics gave, for example, at Leipzig 1631, the Scottish musketeers in the Swedish army managed to break by themselves an attack by Imperial cuirassiers. We're talking about fire alone. As early as 1631, you have one instance. This was definitely not normal. It was exceptional also for Swedish standards, but again, of shot fencing off the strongest, the heaviest cavalry charge that you could see around. You had to add, in fact, the fire of up to 12 light regimental guns attached to each brigade in the Swedish army. Right? This would favor what I was talking about before. In many ways, it's less scenographic than it sounds. It's still a Pike-and-Shot tactics, as slow and clumsy as it can be, but it's much more dynamic than the one that you had witnessed up to that point. Right? It's a much closer combination of artillery and the other arms than had ever been previously attempted. If you look at the history of Pike-and-Shot warfare, you do not see this before the Swedes do. So there were lots of technological improvements behind this that were functional to the tactics, not the other way around in comparison. And lots, as such, right, lots of failures as well, right? Because you don't create the technology and just apply that successfully. You have copper and leather 1.5 pounders dropped. This caused an incident where some sort of impolite Germans accused the very hungry Swedes of having literally eaten those weapons. And again, these armies were in a condition of material misery that you have no idea of, you even want to know, even if they were the best soldiers out there. But the 30 Years' War is no joke, and war in general is not. One of Gustavus Adolphus' Scottish artillerists, Sandy Hamilton, developed light 3-pounders, which, with the aid of preloaded cartridges could fire usually this hail shot just more rapidly than the musketeers, it seems. Being carried, in fact, together with Ben, was keeping up with the infantry advance on the battlefield. That, by the way, was something a bit slower than, of course, a normal infantry march. This would be Beaufort's guns, basically. But it shows you, like, this were not, say, the game changes. As you've seen here, it's like in an orchestra. You need all the instruments to be played in the right way to have the piece performed, right? But what is fascinating of this is the ingenuity behind the new tactical requirements. Again, this gun was not invented because, you know, it was invented in a vacuum. It was invented for that specific tactics, which highlights, as always, the fact that it's not technology that makes tactics. It's the other way around. It's tactics that make technology. Technology does influence, right? But just to a marginal extreme. Like, we can't be 1 to 10, right? In proportion, and still being subjected to all other issues that are strictly military in nature, that do not have to do with a technology or another. But this aspect of preloaded cartridges is also fascinating. As we were saying before, at least Gustavus Adolphus is credited to have basically done the same thing, right? For muskets, the idea that you would have the bow already in the cartridge with the powder, so you wouldn't have to waste further time in the loading for combining the two. In any case, it's also true, these things, that the bigger thing worked, right? The purpose, as we said before, was achieving this fire shock, especially, to be exploited not just with cavalry. This is yet another interesting aspect, but with pikemen. In fact, the Swedish infantry was trained to charge in after a volley rather than passively defend the shot, as tactics had up to that point mostly suggested. At least, of course, there was always an army that advanced, and the pikes existed basically as long as the shot was not enough to wear it out, to wear the pike out to functional degree of which that pike would be dysfunctional to attack the other pikes. Of course, this worked on a level of symmetry of some sort, for which more or less Western European armies still, in spite of these single differences, evolved along the same timeline, tactically speaking. But the very idea that a pikeman could simply charge in itself and not slowly advance at pace to maintain formation is quite telling of the times, because the pike, as we were saying before, was actually being ever more discarded. I mean, the 30 Years' War was really the moment in which this was rendered more was accelerated, at least, and sort of past the telling the truth, well, the shot had already by that point, well, yeah, let's say the 30 Years' War made it, like the watershed was crossed, at least in a functional sense. It's possible the shot was already more relevant than the pike. This was the moment in which it was basically established, right, informally. And this tells you that, albeit, of course, the pike was still needed, the pikemen were sort of adapting to the same pacing of the shots. In other words, again, their action, their assault, was in some cases subordinated to the actual shot. Right, these guys were, as we've seen, ever closer to the enemy. They could charge, and as such, they would be conceptually slightly different from the average pikeman. As such, there were other weapons that were sort of coming back on the fore, even there, for the same reasons cavalry, cold steel was. All right. The interesting aspect, by the way, is that this pike assaults, let's say, would be concerted for eventually falling back, making the troops falling back right, to allow the musketeers a second volley. In other words, they would make this pikeman charge and then retreating to allow, right, so the musketeers to reload in peace and deliver the second volley in a way that makes you see now the pike literally subordinated to the single shots of the musketeers, right? So as we've seen, volley firing had been powered, but the reloading times, aside from the tactical improvements of firearms, were still pretty long. So at least an engagement could follow also for in melee to be functional enough between the bursts of fire. All right, there is an idea that basically once Gustavus Adolphus, having increased the proportion of pikes, however, to that in the essentially defensive Dutch army. This was at times thought to be a balance between the arms, the fact that to some extent if you exposed more the shot, you also had to have some sort of greater stopping power, so you couldn't quite simply do without the pikes. You just improve the shot performance, but that would give you even some more room for actual pikemen. This concept has been in part debated. I will not digress on this specifically, but one must always bear in mind that, first of all, numbers were under strength. You would say, well, okay, but wasn't it the same for the shot as well? Well, it does seem that the shot was much closer to paper strength than the pike, so it seems, at least. It's important to stress. And also what we said before about the early Vasa's armies, and that is the fact that paradoxically the Swedes had never actually developed before Gustavus Adolphus a fully functional pike arm compared to other countries. It may sound astonishing, but it was something about the archaic military Swedish culture that had essentially failed in creating effective pike squares. Or at least there were, of course, the Swedes fought like the other Europeans, but these were chronically understrength at some point, dysfunctional, poorly equipped and trained, and so it's likely, it's possible at least, that in Gustavus Adolphus times, rather than scaling down the pregress, sort of Renaissance style pike square of some sort, like to fluidify this tactics. Actually, the Swedish were still concerned in creating functional pikemen for what they could. Right, so this may be the reason why actually Gustavus Adolphus is, aside from other tactical dynamics, is said to have possibly even increased the proportion, at least, of pikes, which, remember, we're talking about smaller tactical units, so this doesn't necessarily mean that in absolute terms we're even more pikes than before, but it's still relevant because that stopping power in order to, still fighting the 30 Years' War was quite needed, right? You couldn't do without the pike or simply just throwing it away, say, on every occasion, like in the major battles of the 30 Years' War. Some of the greatest Swedish victories were, of course, about having a pretty solid pike wall in all of this. And again, these also the Swedish accomplishments were massive, but in proportion to the times, like still their armies looked pretty much like the one of other peoples. There was an improvement in infantry equipment, which stemmed again from the particular financial availabilities of Gustavus Adolphus, because of French support, because of the steel that the Swedes exported from their mines, especially to places like England later on during the Industrial Revolution. Sweden will have a lot of stuff that the British industry needed, would keep needing. So there was some degree of material availability at this point. Gustavus Adolphus is attributed many of these more technical innovations some of which appear even radical to the point that we are sure, of course, they're just a myth, right? Some of these innovations attributed to Gustavus Adolphus, again, wouldn't kick in the same Swedish army, but, a couple of generations later. But at least the idea, again, that there was a necessity to starting to uniform on this basis, to functionalize accordingly, is surely something that Gustavus Adolphus had in mind, like basically most generals at the time. And of course, the capacity of implementing that for a country, if this general was a king, it's another story. The most important improvements were achieved in the uniformation of the muskets and also of their ammo. Probably firing a ball of 10 to the pound, which was the standard now in the Dutch army, at least the one sought after. We know that in the later part of Gustavus' reign, the Swedish-made muskets, however, were shortened to 120 centimeters overall. This, together with a lighter stock, could cut the weight of the gun by about a third. At least if you visit the Army Museum in Stockholm, you will find such figures. The point, of course, is relevant for two reasons. The first one is that the musket, as you know, had evolved historically, even from literally a light artillery type. It was so big and bulky that it would just go down in terms of size through technological refinement, etc. But the particular need why Gustavus Adolphus musketeers needed these shorter muskets was also the fact that we were highlighting before. They would need it more, at least in other armies, because they were the ones whose tactics were based on this quicker, faster, and a more, let's say easier to handle movements, right? They were to be replicated again mechanically, quickly, without almost even thinking, right? Even though it was still quite complicated to reload everything, etc. This standardization again allowed the musketeers to even just come closer to the enemy and being able also to pull back more safely from an engagement. And there was, of course, no total standardization achieved. Like by this time, no country had the capacity of doing that. You can argue that not even today we have technically a full standardization, at least for what will be used in terms of individual equipment on a battlefield. Considering that the Swedish at this point were still not go over to flint or will-locks, right? The majority still had the matchlock, which was more reliable and more within also the modest capabilities of Swedish lock makers. Yes, the country was living a phase of relative prosperity, also thanks to military expansionism, but they weren't a particularly technologically advanced country, and so you fight with what you have, and in order to make it get there, it's all something that has to happen behind the scenes. Here we mentioned Oxenstierna just cursorily, but there is a lot of state building and administration behind, of course, the Swedish Army of the 30 Years' War that we can't simply digress on now. Speaking of other technical innovations, the aforementioned lack of effective pikemen in the Swedish army in the early modern era had brought the Swedish musketeers to rely on the so-called swine feathers. There are basically some pointy sticks fixed in the ground, a bit like the poles of the English armies of the 100 Years' War, to literally defend themselves from cavalry, as musketeers are missile, that is light infantry. So if you had, especially again, weaker stopping heavy infantry, you wanna use these precautions, right? Gustavus Adolphus, in spite of, again, all the mythology regarding what he would have allegedly done or not done in terms of these military technical innovations, would not, also because it wouldn't make sense at that point, abolish the musket rest, right? The aforementioned commanded musketeers detachment, those 96 guys that ran after cavalry, may have been dispensed from using it. But they just would have handled, as we've seen, also lighter types of guns when possible. They would have specialized in that, in technical detail that we just do not know with precision, but that we can imagine, given their tactical employment. Also, the sense that the pikes themselves would have been shortened to 3 meters and 35 is a myth. It seemingly stemmed from the fact that some Swedish partisans were 11 feet long, which is the same figure, and these weapons were carried by the King's Life Guard of Foot that counted 1 company. It's possible that also the Household Regiment adopted the partisan instead of the pike in Gustavus Adolphus' times. We're not sure about this, but again, 300 whatever, I don't know, 11 feet really is. It's actually, he made these guys using these weapons that were 11 feet long, so it's not as long as the pike, but were these pikes, doesn't matter, we're partisans. But we do not care. He shortened the pike. You see how myths come about just out of imprecision, etc. We actually have a pretty solid evidence that the Swedish regulations demanded for pikes to be over 5 meters and a half long. We have a 1619 order reducing them only to 17 feet and 6 inches. So we're talking about at most like a few tens of centimeters. This does show a shortening of the pike. We do know that Swedish pikemen, just like many pikemen before them, would tend to shorten them because it would have been easier to carry them, which triggered their commanders pretty much. As we said, it's also true that just it's the pike that declines. I mean, it may have been more important the difference in the number of pikes, the decrease in them specifically, than the actual shortening of the same. Then of course the things do influence each other, but not in a directly proportional way, because still pikes have to be of a specific length. I mean, there were units of pikemen on desperate occasions, also during the Napoleonic Wars, even though they had been doctrinally abandoned by convention. There was still at this time an important degree of armoredness. Swedish musketeers were supposed to wear an open helmet. They had a sword, as it was usual, and a bandolier with 12 cartouches, while the pikemen had helmet, gorget, corselet, and, at least originally, and especially in the front ranks, thigh pieces or short tassets, right? But these were falling out of use because it was better to invest in firepower than in protection from the same. It's the same reason why armor was, generally speaking, in the last phase of its existence, at least in a widespread, say, uniform way for important chunks of the army as a whole. Swedish officers carried partisans. We know that at least up to the 30 Years' War, officers were distinguished by gilded gorgets. Still at this point, officers, however, had a very a greater freedom in clothing, in showing off. They were part of the nobility, and so the higher you went in rank, and the more customized your look really was on the battlefield. Let's remember this: even though Gustavus Adolphus is credited with the introduction, say, of the modern concept of uniforms, this is also a sort of a categoristic exaggeration. Of course, yes, there is in the Swedish army, as we've seen also with the colored regiments, a necessity to start standardizing to some important degree. Even the clothes of the individual soldiers, recognizing them more quickly from the distance. The Swedes had this enhanced tactical interaction, so they had to, at a glance, just to understand who was who on the battlefield, also the friendlies, in order to just to command them more effectively. But still, again, this was mostly a theoretical, like mostly was still banners that worked in that way, like also because of course masses were concentrated, you could distinguish individual units. But again, especially I imagine even for the more mobile troops, you would have more need of standardization, like all these musketeers jumping around may have needed to be, just for their safety, in spite of course being more visible, more recognizable, of course, to be spotted by their fellow man. It just gave just a greater sense of the unit, of the corps, how scattered you were, whether you needed to pull back, to regroup, whatever. It was sort of easier to do in those massive battlefields where you literally disappeared, like the same Gustavus Adolphus actually did out there. This is true for the cavalry, as you understand, but this thing was being extended just to the pikes. We know that NCOs of pikes carried pikes themselves. The ones of musketeers instead carried partisans, which is interesting too. And there was some symbolism, telling the truth, attached to that. I mean, the idea this spread actually from the Catholic side, that say it was a honor to be a humble pikeman, even for a nobleman. I mean, not in this case as NCOs, but the idea that also aristocrats had to start from the lowest, most humble ranks as a file and rank pikeman. And the fact that here the musketeer NCOs carried partisans seems more. I mean, partisans would be carried by NCOs later on, still, but it has to do with something with not just representation, but literal use. Right? Never think that any weapon is simply symbolic on a battlefield. Right? If employed by fighting units, there is always some ancestral practicality to that. Or you could have seen people ripped apart by partisans. Still, at this point, actually, there's nothing strange. There are lots of pole arms in general. Like we imagine enormous levels of combination. Again, the Swedes also fought in Eastern Europe in places where, again, warfare was particularly backwards, and you can imagine all kind of combinations to a degree. But it would be the Swedes also because of that too that would have developed the most advanced, at least tactically speaking, armies of the time. And Gustavus Adolphus, for this reason, definitely maintains quite a place of honor in the firmament of the great commanders, the great leaders, but also the great military reformers and innovators. As long as we understand what he actually did and didn't do, why is that this idea came around, and what is the concrete value of the Swedish military at this point. And I really hope, in fact, that we're going to talk about this. We'll talk more about cavalry and artillery, and also about sort of 16th century Swedish army, right? Also a bit the later one, say the one that we observed in the video about Charles X that I made a couple of months ago. In the video it's one of the few videos made about strategy, actually about the Swedish invasion of Poland and Denmark between 1655 and 1660. So there is a lot to do as always, and I'm glad every step of the way how far we can go. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.